Joining me in studio tonight, Zine Nkukwana. She's with South African Women in ICT, and Judy Nokwedi, who is with the Black Business Council. Let me thank you both for your time. I first want to begin with this protest that's been planned for Friday, because the cry that's being made by civil society organizations and students, as we've heard today, is that business has not been responsive to the problem of gender-based violence, and that in fact they could very well be in a unique position to help in terms of bringing in the resources that are required to fight this scourge, which is why they're taking the march now to the door of business. As women in business, I wonder if you agree with that sentiment. I'll begin with you, Judy.
Look, it's a tough question, and I would say that business can do a lot more. And what we have done as the Black Business Council, as the mounting and the pressure has increased to do something, I mean, I believe that we need what Germany and the rest of the world did during the war, and that is a Marshall Plan, and a Marshall Plan to stop violence. Because if the narrative is only around gender-based violence, I think we're missing the mark. So it really is around our society. Our country is violent, and therefore, of course, at the moment, the greatest victims and survivors are children and women, and then young boys in terms of male-on-male violence. So business can do a lot more. As the Black Business Council, we have joined in protests where it's been in areas that we work. We have called for a pledge as Black Business Council, and we are also looking very seriously at what more can we do. So, for instance, one of our major affiliates is NAFCOC, and it is one of the organizations in terms of the affiliates where the taxi associations belong, the hawkers belong, truck drivers belong, because there's also a very strong correlation between violence and poverty, and violence and disassociated and disengaged communities. So we believe as Black business, we have a very, very important role, and we can play a powerful role in stopping this violence.
Yeah. Zine?
Yeah, I agree so much with our study here, that this fight is not only meant for government. It cannot happen if it's only government who must do something about what is happening out there. So we need everyone, particularly business, we need them to join in this fight. And really, truly speaking, when you're looking at what is happening out there, particularly the killing of our children, when I'm looking at what has happened in the UCT last week, where this young child was killed, and you're thinking that they had gone to a post office, which is a business entity, and you're actually looking and wanting to find out where have we gone wrong as a society? What is it that the business can actually do? And us from South African Women in ICT Forum, we really are joining hands, and we're saying no to this. We need everyone to help.
In those very seats that you're sitting last week, we had gender activists who across the board said business, in fact, is often complicit when it comes to not highlighting issues of gender-based violence or even harassment that takes place in the workplace. In fact, Lisa Vetten telling us that there's such little research done on it, and it's impossible to research because it never ever gets to the court, or it never ever goes through an official process of being recorded by police, because private entities often just choose to close it up and deal with it. Is that the case?
Yeah.
You know, I listened to that interview last week, and I always say we've got to be very cautious around the narrative we propagate, because we also have to look at this in terms of its global context. Do you know, I'm talking to the viewers, that 1 in 3 women are physically assaulted globally? 1 in 4 women will end up seriously harmed and raped. And in Australia, there was a very famous saying by one of the judges: why do you go on and on about rape? It's just rougher than normal handling. 140 countries have criminalized domestic violence, yet it is the prosecution of the perpetrator where it falls down. So we must stop blaming each other. Yes, business can do a lot more, communities can do a lot more, churches can do a lot more, government can do a lot more. The reality is we should all do something. And if we keep blaming each other, which has become almost the national norm in South Africa, because if I can decant my responsibility into another lane or into another bin, then I'm off the hook. Now, most companies, and certainly the companies where I have worked, have got very serious sexual harassment policies. We have wellness programs. So in a way, businesses have instituted policies and frameworks. What we don't do in South Africa, which many countries do, and I have had the opportunity of working in many countries, if they have serious programs around family violence and family wellnesses, because when you come into the workplace, you come in as part of a member of the family. So I think in that respect, we can do a lot more. Now, my anxiety, and I've become known as the angry woman around the table. I've become known as the woman who no longer has a sense of humor. And I've said I'm quite happy to be the angry woman, and sometimes the only woman around a boardroom table. And I'll remain angry until things change. Because where does this begin? It begins with a very serious societal problem and a cultural problem, and a traditional problem where women are devalued, women are disrespected. So men come into the workplace, men from very good schools and so-called very normal, functional families, and they make derogatory comments about women. They make sexist comments about women. And men speak when the men bromance each other, and hey, how's it, and you know, and men have to be prove who they are. So hypermasculinity and toxic masculinity, yes, it's as prevalent in boardrooms, it's prevalent in the pubs where men go, it's prevalent when they have their boys' nights out and their stag parties. It's across the board. It's unacceptable everywhere you look.
Zine, as you come in, I wonder then what it's going to take to create a safe space, a safe environment within corporate South Africa, if the systems are in place, but the systems are not necessarily doing a good job of being responsive of those that have survived harassment or that are victims of harassment coming forward. What do we do?
You know, as much as I would like to get into that, you know, I think let's also not forget, because Judy is talking about, you know, the formal type of an environment where you will have the policies in HR governing this and governing that. But I really want us to also highlight the plight of the women who are out there, your entrepreneurs, who are also looking for business. And when they go there, in case they, well, unless they do certain things in order for them to get the business, and we're not talking about that at all. So because from South African Women in ICT Forum, we stand for, you know, we're promoting entrepreneurs. And these people, they've got business ideas, but in order for them to be able to get into the business or getting funding or something like that, they, you know, they're asked, they're being harassed and being asked for favors that really demean a woman. So therefore, those things we also need to highlight. So when it comes now to the policies, in as far as human resources policies are concerned, if business or companies are not really strict enough to say that if you're a perpetrator, you need to go, you need to be dismissed, those things also do not happen. And I've worked, you know, as a human resources manager before, and I know what I'm talking about.
Sure. As
much as we would try, but some of these things do not get reported, Cathy. And that one is the biggest outcry. And if you're looking right now on Facebook, last week something was created talking about not another child after Uyinene's death. And if you're looking at the stories that came in there, they will kill you.
All right. I'm going to give us a moment then just to go to a short break. We'll continue our conversation. And I think I want to explore that issue of especially female entrepreneurs. What exactly are they being asked for? And of course, exchange, perhaps for doing work. We'll continue our conversation with Zine and Judy after this. Do stay with us. You're live on News at Prime. A quick reminder of the top stories that we're tracking for you tonight. The ANC in Parliament now saying it's going to push for the National Register for sex offenders to be made public. Of course, it comes as students also turn up the heat, joining those marches against gender-based violence. Our government and ambassadors meeting to try and figure out the fallout following the violence that we've seen spread out in different parts of Gauteng, some of it targeted towards foreign-owned shops. And also today, Nicholas Minu pleads guilty to 4 charges against him, saying he was under the influence of drugs when he raped a 7-year-old girl. And in your sport, no more tennis for Kevin Anderson for the rest of 2019. You're live on News at Prime. We continue our conversation then in studio, dealing with the issue of gender-based violence and some of the solutions that are really needed and being pushed for in this moment. And joining me in studio tonight, we're looking particularly at the impact of gender-based violence, particularly on business. Of course, on Friday, we're expecting that what is commonly referred to as the richest square mile in Africa to be brought to a standstill as civil society groups and students vow to be part of a march that's been scheduled for the 13th of Friday. So Zine Nkukwana is with South African Women in ICT. Judy Nokwedi is with the Black Business Council. We continue our conversation. Before we went to the ad break, Zine, you were speaking about entrepreneurs, female entrepreneurs in particular, who are finding themselves having to almost deal with trade-offs in return for business. Talk to us about how this happens so that, you know, the viewers at home and even I can understand where the issue really lies.
You know, what hurts, Cathy, is that we know that the rate of unemployment in South Africa right now is way too high. So therefore, the government is actually promoting entrepreneurship. Hence, from South African Women in ICT Forum, we're actually talking that, and we want people to get into the ICT space within this 4th industrial revolution that everybody is talking about. But we know for a fact, I mean, these stories come to us, and we've met people who will say that in order for them to be able to get business, whether within government or within even the private sector, you know, certain favors are asked of them. You really need to be very ethical to know who you are, you know, and stand your ground to say, no, I can actually be able to do this thing without the assistance that you say you're going to be giving me based on me giving you some certain favors that you
What are these favors? Is it, you know, favors of a sexual kind?
Yes.
South Africa is a country that's high in corruption, so it could also include money. And perhaps just break it down for us so that we see how it fits in overall to this current mood of fighting gender-based violence.
Can I give you the example
Sure.
from South African women in construction?
Sure.
Because the barrier to entry for many women in construction is some degree of resilience and determination. So not so long ago, you had our chapter, the South African Women in Construction. So at a municipal level, a woman or a group of women will pitch for business, and whoever is sitting across the table who has the power to award a contract will make very explicit sexual demands in exchange for the contract. So you will have to sleep with the men in order to get the contract. In many of the depots where we have transport workers working, and women who have to work night shift are more vulnerable because it is at night when they are then put into very dangerous situations. And we had the example of the young Eskom woman who was raped when she went to one of the plants. So, you know, it is at so many different levels where a woman will be very clearly, there will be demands made of her. Then, of course, if the sexual favor is not returned, or if it is then coerced, it is then followed with violence. And in the extreme case, it then, because once you have put a woman in a situation where you don't get what you want, and you then beat her up, you then have to kill her because she's going to potentially report you or identify you. So that sequence or the consequence of what starts off with this is what I want and this is what I demand can then end in a gruesome fatality.
What is the recourse that women have? Because in a situation like this, surely that person who is a municipal manager, a state official, should not be in that kind of a position.
Some of these demands, for lack of a better word, they are not that explicit, but you get to know what is it that the person is asking for. And the other thing that you must also understand that, there's a syndicate. You might think that this one person, you are going to be reporting them. And whom are you going to be reporting them to? Because maybe even that person is also part of this. So therefore you are left there as a woman entrepreneur not knowing where to go, because sometimes, 9 times out of 10, even when you go to the police station, we've had those cases that when you go to the police station you get to be ridiculed, that maybe there's something that you also have done in order for this to happen to you.
I wonder, from the experiences that both of you have had then with, female entrepreneurs coming to you, women entrepreneurs rather, coming to you with these issues, do they feel that there is opportunity for recourse? So what do I do when I'm in a situation like this? What are my options?
Well, the recourse is where the problem lies. And last week, Lisa Fetton talked about that if you're in a big corporate, what often happens is the perpetrator is dismissed. Sometimes with the dismissal comes the boys' club that comes together, and they will then secure employment for that perpetrator in another group. And I'm not going to mention the companies. Their names have been all over the papers in the last 2 years, where you've had cases of sexual harassment and sexual exploitation in the workplace. For the women in the township, for the women in a rural area, for the women in informal settlements where she's selling pup on the side of the road, or she's a depot worker, or she's working for a cleaning agency, her recourse is slightly more difficult because A, she doesn't have the mechanisms at her disposal, she doesn't have the resources at her disposal, and she doesn't have the levels of articulation or the expertise to navigate a system around how do I address it. Look at those women in the food industry who were made to strip, who were made to do all kinds of inhumane things. So when you're in the corporate sector, you are slightly better off. But last week, across all boardrooms and all structures, including the Black Business Council, we decided, and the men in our organizations decided, that they are embarrassed by being men. They feel that men are letting other men down. So I do believe that we've reached a turning point in South Africa where men are beginning to say, we have a role to play. We must play a role because things have got to change. And I feel there's a different mood at the moment in business.
Let me come in.
Sure.
Let me come in there, because really for me, I stand for those women who are down in the rural areas who do not have a voice. I stand for those women who are down there in the townships who do not have a voice. I see the women who are in corporate. I've been in corporate, and I know that they're a little bit protected than those that I know of whom, when these things happen to them, they don't have anybody to talk to, starting from the family. Even if they say this thing at home, the family, they're going to be ridiculed or end up being beaten by their husbands or their boyfriends, as if there's something that they've done in order for these things to happen to them. So the recourse, as far as I'm concerned, is the government really tightening up. And we need to stop these talk shows that we're having, because every day, I was actually looking at something. I asked another friend of mine, Dilega Mandela, to send me something that happened last year when there was a whole presidential summit, again talking about this gender-based violence, where even some women stripped naked there, showing, it was actually very, very sad. And I'm looking at whatever the recommendations that were coming from that, and I'm trying to see from then to now what has happened, and nothing. This hype that we're having right now is because of what has happened last week, as well as this child who also died today, who was found, yesterday. So after this, what's happening? We always are very reactionary as South Africans. And what happens after that?
I want us to speak then about the role, particularly of men in all of this? You've talked about a pledge being one of the things that you're going to be coming up with. We saw today one of the newspapers also running a pledge for all men to take and to read in front of their partners, their families, dedicating themselves to helping being part of the fight against gender-based violence. But is this conversation reaching the corners of society that it needs to reach? Because I know that when the experience I've had is that if you're with people who are constantly on social media, there's a genuine anger about it. But on the street, people are going on with their lives. In some parts of our society, this conversation is not even taking place. How do we reach those places?
You know, the conversation, I believe, is reaching all corners. But so you talked about, give me an example, the lived reality of people. You know, I grew up on the Cape Flats. My first encounter with serious violence was when I was a 12-year-old girl. So that's a long time ago. And today, the levels of violence just on the Cape Flats within itself has reached the proportion where the army we've been led to believe that the army is being deployed. The army has come in there for 2 hours at a time, and then they move. So the deployment of the army, in my humble view, has been somewhat superficial, because the army needs to be there 24/7 every day, because when they move from one corner, it's not just on the Cape Flats, Khayelitsha, Nyanga, Gugulethu, it could be Reveille, it could be Noordgezicht. But we must have an effective police system. If a woman, and we say the violence is underreported in South Africa, it's underreported because when you go to the police station, you are confronted with a different degree of dehumanization and additional trauma. So number one, we need to get our courts right, we need to get the different centers that have been set up right, and our police officers need to be trained. How can you deal with those protesters at the convention center last week with more levels of violence?
I absolutely take the point. And I've got 20 seconds for you. I need to go to break urgently.
I actually disagree. I don't think this conversation is reaching out to everybody. For starters, not everyone is on Twitter, not everyone is on social media. So the people who are deep down in the rural areas who are not even watching us right now, they're not getting this conversation at all. So we need to do something more.
All right.
Than just that.
Let me thank you both for your time tonight. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for this interview, but it certainly has been incredibly insightful. We'll continue to see then what the response is from business on Friday, but the insights that we get into part of what's happening behind the scene and even corporate culture in South Africa has been absolutely fascinating. I certainly hope that more women in business will be open to having this conversation with us and really just taking us into some of what happens behind the scenes. So we'll leave it there for now. Mark Lewis is standing by. He has your sport in a moment. Do stay with us.